Hello and welcome to the Author Talk event series brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University MA in Science Writing and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Kathryn Schulz on her craft and her new memoir, Lost and Found. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the MA in Science Writing playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the host of our program, Olivia Gentile.
Hello and welcome. I'm delighted to have one of my favorite writers, Kathryn Schulz, here from her home on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. She writes about books, science, history, and pretty much everything else for The New Yorker. And her journalism has won both a Pulitzer Prize and a National Magazine Award. She is out this year with a new book called Lost and Found, a memoir. And Helen McDonald describes it as a tender, searching meditation on love and loss and what it means to be human. Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we have in our audience tonight a lot of early career writers who are interested in hearing about how you got your start. And I was interested to learn that you initially thought you might pursue a PhD in history after college. Can you tell us about that and about why you decided not to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a really great experience as an undergraduate. I went to Brown and I studied history, and I just was lucky. You know, I had a true mentor there, a kind of intellectual hero, and I had an intellectual community, which I don't know how common it is in college. And so I loved everything about the experience. And I thought, yes, I'm gonna take a year off, you know, and then I'm gonna go apply to programs and get my PhD in history and be a professor. And then for that year off, I moved out to Portland, Oregon, which is a completely beautiful place. But my joke about Portland is that it's where ambition goes to die. So, you know, I spent a year not applying to graduate programs and, you know, just kind of bumming around and hiking and enjoying the scenery. And then 1 year became 2 years and 2 years became 3 years. And at some point in that process, I realized that what was actually interesting to me about a PhD program was the chance to spend my life engaged in the world of language and in the world of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that actually you don't need to get a PhD to do that. You can get a PhD, and that can be a very rewarding way to do it, but there are other roads to that particular realm. And I had always loved writing, and I had started doing a tiny little bit of, you know, stick your toes in the water freelancing while I was out there. And so I thought, maybe that's actually the direction I want to go.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that strikes me is that even though there are some commonalities between academia and journalism, with academia, there's a very clear path to breaking in. You apply for a doctoral program. And with journalism, you have to be improvisational and scrappy. And I was wondering if you could give us a little insight into your early gigs and commissions and how you improvised.
Yeah, I absolutely can. And I just want to second on behalf of the audience of early career writers tonight, I want to second the difficulty of not having an obvious career path. Like, it's not like I want to become a doctor and then, like, for good or ill, like the 457 steps you have to take are laid out in front of you. It's really unclear how you wind up becoming a writer if that's what you want to do. And I guess the thing to say is, you know, it always looks glamorous and shiny from the far end of things. And I love my career and I feel incredibly fortunate about it. But I mean, I had a lot of bad jobs and a lot of kind of dumb clips to get here, you know, and the early years were full of just desperately finding anyone who would let me write for them. And that might have been like, you know, a local community newspaper dedicated to like how to make our neighborhood greener, you know, and I was at the very, it was the very early days of, online magazines, as they were then called. And so I, kind of knocked on the door of every former college roommate's older brother's friend who'd started one of those, and tried to get a few clips that way. And then eventually, after a kind of meandering path of day jobs, basically, I left the country. Actually, I went and I worked for a year at an English language newspaper in Santiago, Chile, which was an absolutely terrible job. Ultimately, I loved Chile. It took a while, but I loved it. It was an interesting place. I learned a lot, but everything about the job was kind of horrible, which isn't necessarily bad for the soul, yeah, it was very roundabout. And when I finally moved back to New York, because I felt I wasn't actually, despite nominally working for a newspaper, I wasn't really learning enough or doing enough, and I wanted to truly try writing. I got a very steady day job. I worked as an editor for the online environmental journal Grist, which has since really been thriving, which is great to see. But I was working 49, 55, 70 hours a week as an editor, just to make a living, or not, to make a living in order around the edges, to do a tiny bit of freelance writing. So it was slow, is the short answer.
Right. But you gradually built up to larger publications and more in-depth stories. And then you published your first book, Being Wrong, Adventures in the Margin of Error, which is about human fallibility. And I'm sure you've been asked this before, but could you share with us a mistake you made early on in your career that you learned from?
Interestingly, I have not been asked that before. It's a great question. And probably a zillion years ago when that book came out, I would have had at my fingertips all of the mistakes I'd made, because it's embarrassing not to be able to answer that question, because I've made a zillion of them. But I'm trying to think about a mistake that's specific to the career. And, I guess, I made a million mistakes as a writer, like on the level of craft. And I think I made an emotional mistake of thinking I was a better writer than I was, because I'd been one of these little kids who was like, kind of lauded by her teachers and her loving parents as like, oh, you're a good writer for your age. And then at some point your age is irrelevant, right? And you're just trying to learn to write like everybody else. And there was a lot I didn't understand about how prose works. So on a kind of mechanical level, it was 5-7 years of mistakes, that any decent editor could have looked at a draft if they had any interest, which understandably they didn't, and told me what I was doing wrong. But I wish I could think of a more specific example for you.
No, that's okay. Was there a particular editor you ended up learning a lot of craft from, or was it just a gradual process of reading and writing and revising and improving?
It was pretty gradual, to tell you the truth. And some of that is, it's my fault. I think I'm oddly kind of most receptive to criticism from myself. Like I'm a very harsh critic of my own work. And so when you're starting out and you're not able to land pieces, you can console yourself for a while and say, oh, it's all about connections, or like, I just don't have enough clips. But at some point you got to be like, well, maybe I'm just not doing the right thing, and I should go read more closely the journalism I really admire and try to take it apart and understand how it works. Which is not to say I haven't had amazing editors. Interestingly, they weren't necessarily in my early career, partly because a kind of painful reality I think about journalism is often you finally have a enduring, long-standing relationship with an editor when you've already kind of landed at a magazine and have a job and they're invested in you. But you never don't need it. I mean, I had a brilliant and lovely editor at New York Magazine, which is where I was before I came to the New Yorker, a guy by the name of Jared Holt, who I just completely adore. And by the time I started writing for Jared, I had been writing professionally for many years. And Jared, kind of got 3 pieces into working with me. And in his very gentle way, he said, it's very interesting, Kathryn, you end every story 3 times. And I was like, what? And he just handed me like the last 3 pieces of mine in draft form. And I was like, boy, that's actually true. I always have 2 extra endings. And to this day, I have to, go, sometimes I decide to leave them in. But, someone who works with you over time and is astute like that does start pointing out your tics. And that's incredibly, incredibly helpful.
And who did you study? You said you studied journalists you admire. Who did you study? Or who do you study still?
Well, I certainly cut my teeth on the New Yorker. I'm incredibly happy to have landed there because I grew up in a house. My dad subscribed to the New Yorker my whole life. And I grew up, it's funny to read the New Yorker as a child because you don't understand any of it. And the first thing you age into, at least in my experience, was the movie reviews. Because I'm like, oh, movies, like I see movies. And so, I can remember reading Pauline Kael and then later on Anthony Lane and thinking, this is brilliant and funny, and I actually understand it. And I still feel that way about the New Yorker and my colleagues, and I admire them a lot and try to understand how their work works, so to speak.
Yeah.
I also really love the natural world, and so I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about the writing of people like David Quammen and John McPhee and these kind of giants of nature writing who almost kind of brought me with them into the field because I loved their work so much. So
Right.
I'm sure there's a much longer list, but that would be a start.
And so were you hired for a particular beat at the New Yorker?
Nominally. Yes, I was theoretically hired as a book critic. That's what I've been doing. A really wonderful thing happens when you write a book, which is that people start asking you to review other books, which I didn't realize would happen when my first book came out. And then I started doing it and I thought it was wonderful fun. And also just this kind of dreamy job. I remember going into New York Magazine when I was first hired, and there's like a room full of packages waiting to be opened, and every one of those packages has a book inside. And now, of course, it's like a burden on my recycling bin, but at the time it just seemed like Hanukkah morning. I mean, just incredibly delightful, and it is, of course, and it's a wonderful job. So I've been doing that for New York, and I was hired at the New Yorker to be a book critic, but I walked in the door there with an idea for a piece that was not a book piece. And that was a piece about seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest. Okay. And from the get-go, my editor knew I wanted to write it and said, yes, go ahead and write it. And very patient David Remnick, who I think really just very much wanted and needed a book critic at that moment, said, yeah, sure, go ahead and write it. And then that piece turned out to be really fun to write and to do okay. And I think that's what enabled me in part to kind of branch out and do these other strange things, science writing or history or whatever it may be. Although partly I also think that is a kind of beauty of the institution, which is that you are, there is room, even if you are meant to be covering something, there is room to kind of follow your interests and follow your heart and follow something you think is a great story.
Right. So when you have an idea for a story, do you first develop it a little bit before you bring it to your editor? To make sure they want you to go ahead and write the story? Or do you tell your editor right away, I have this idea, what do you think?
I'm kind of impulsive, so I often tell my editor right away, but sometimes I sit on it for a little while. Some of it depends on how far behind I am on other deadlines. One of the things I really appreciate about my job, I love my editor at the magazine, and he's just authentically brilliant. And in my experience, it does pay to invite him into an idea on the early side, because he often can sort of picture versions of it or angles of it, or simply suggest things I should go read or go think about that I might not have occurred to. So I'm usually pretty forthcoming about it. It's also, this will be, wonderful news, I'm sure, to many of you. It's a pretty, and I shouldn't generalize about the magazine because I actually think different editor-writer relationships there work wildly differently, but it's an extremely informal conversation. I'm interested in writing about X, sometimes it's an email. And I will say that after years and years and years and years and years of pitching pieces, which to my mind, and probably to many of yours, is actually, frankly, one of the worst parts of the job. It's a real delight, and I am mindful, a real privilege to be able to just kind of banter back and forth about ideas and settle on some.
Now, one thing I noticed reading your stories since you got to the New Yorker is many of them are infused with a sense of optimism about human nature. And I'm wondering if you're a natural optimist or if you have to work really hard, especially nowadays, to cultivate that.
Both, I think. I do think that I am, I don't know if I'm exactly naturally optimistic, but I am naturally inclined to take the side of hope and possibility. Maybe those are the same thing. It's funny, I've been thinking about that a lot. Amazement. Say again?
In your book, you also call it amazement.
An amazement, yeah, yeah. And I think that there's no question that's been incredibly difficult these last many years now. And that's profoundly upsetting. I think despair is both a real thing. I have felt it. I know many other people have felt it for better reasons and more sustained periods of time, and in ways that stem from more intimate and menacing fears about their life or about the future. But even if it is occasionally the appropriate response, I think it is never the useful one. And so I try very hard not to rest in a place of despair, even if I sometimes can't avoid feeling it.
Another quality that infuses your pieces is boldness, intellectual boldness. And for instance, speaking of nature writing, in your piece, What Do We Hope to Find When We Look for a Snow Leopard, you offer a gentle, but I would say searing critique of nature writing conventions. Can you talk about that?
The nature writing conventions or the instinct to criticize them?
Well, the conventions that you cite are the pilgrimage tradition and the misanthrope tradition of nature writing. And I believe the two writers you're talking about are Peter Mathiasson, who you were a big fan of growing up, and the other guy, do you remember? Frank Wynne. Is he
there are many writers, nature writers one could put in that category, perhaps most self-evidently Thoreau, about whom I have also had a few things to say in the past. Look, we criticize what we don't love, but we also criticize what we love, as we should. Right. And I love vast swaths of nature writing that I can't quite sign off on politically or ideologically. And part of what I recognize is— What do you mean by that?
What do you mean?
Well, I recognize in myself some of the tendencies in those writers that I talk about in those pieces. I recognize in myself the desire to see other human beings as an intrusion on the natural landscape. I recognize in myself the desire to experience nature alone and in some kind of pure and unsullied form, and to disdain and in fact be quite angry or dismissive about any other way of being in it or experiencing it. And I don't think that is an admirable instinct or a tenable instinct, and I don't think it does anyone any favors in terms of thinking about how the natural world works and how we work within it, because of course we are part of the natural world. And I certainly think it is there is, as I think I say in the piece, a very fine line between misanthropy and misogyny. And I think there's a reason most of the writers I cite in this piece as kind of bearing up this tradition of like the solitary man on a kind of spiritual quest, despairing of other humans, but finding faith and solace in the natural world. There's a reason men write versions of the natural world that sound like that, and women do so far less often, and when they do, generally speaking, far more knowingly. You quoted Helen MacDonald at the beginning of this, and she willfully refuses that tradition even while herself seeking a kind of solace in nature, and she writes beautifully about what's wrong with that tradition, far better than I ever could. So yes, I understand the impulse. I'm even sympathetic to it, but I don't think, I myself am full of impulses I think are not to be admired or emulated.
So let's talk about your book. I want to remind everyone that Kathryn's new book is called Lost and Found. It originated, as far as I can tell, with a piece in the New Yorker in 2017. Had you written much about yourself and your family before that?
I really hadn't. I wrote one quite personal, or I guess by the time the book was out, two quite personal pieces, both of them about my father, both of them after he died. So the book grew out, in part, grew out of an essay I wrote just a handful of months after my father's death in September of 2016. But no, prior to that, I mean, I had occasional excursions into the land of the slightly personal. I once wrote about being a night owl, this kind of thing. But for the most part, I mean, there's very often an I in my piece, like the first person is not an uncommon choice for me in my pieces, but there's a very big difference between the first person and the truly personal. And I have seldom ventured towards the latter before this book.
Mm-hmm. And so as you mentioned, shortly after his death, you wrote some pieces about him, and they were published in maybe 2017. And then when and how did you realize maybe you're going to write a book that it grows out of those pieces?
It was quite a long time later. I mean, it was almost 2 years later, which is because I did not. People kept asking me. I shouldn't overstate. People occasionally asked me if I wanted to turn that essay about the death of my father into a book, and the short answer was always no. I felt like I love my dad. There's infinity things to say about my dad, and he's fun to write about. But I didn't really want to write a book about grief particularly, and I didn't want to spend 2 or 3 or 4 years of my life thinking about nothing else. And there are a lot of really excellent books about grief in the world, and it did not seem to me that I had a clear contribution to make on those terms, which to me is kind of one of the possible litmus tests of whether you should take on a book project or not. Not always a reliable one, but a place to start. Mm-hmm. But that original essay, it was an elegy for my dad. But for those who haven't read it, it's kind of a strange elegy as these things go, because it is also about this broader category of loss and all of the many things we lose, right? Cell phones, keys, faith, elections, loved ones, and the kind of motivating curiosity behind that piece is like, why on earth would all these things be in the same category? And is that linguistic coincidence, or is there something meaningful about this category of all the things we lose, and something we can learn by kind of sitting inside it and exploring it for a while? So ultimately what happened, well, the narrative version is I was on a road trip with my partner, who some of you may have read. She's Casey Sepp, a colleague at the New Yorker. And at the time, she was at work on her first book, Furious Hours, which is about this amazing and insane true crime story that Harper Lee tried to write for many, many years in the decades after she published To Kill a Mockingbird. Right. So while she was working on that book, we spent a bunch of time basically driving around small town Alabama so she could do her reporting. And on one of those drives, very late at night, on some tiny back road in the middle of nowhere, we were talking about, can't remember why it had come up again, but we were talking about this question of like, would I ever want to write more about my father or expand that piece into a book? And in the course of that conversation, it kind of dawned on me that there was this mirror image story to be told, which was, an exploration of the quite similar but very joyful category of discovery. We also find a lot of wildly different things. We find dinosaur fossils, and we find vaccines for a global pandemic, and we find the love of our life. And I realized, I could do the same thing. I could explore that category, but the emotional heart of that part of the book would be, the greatest thing I ever found, which is this woman who's next to me driving the car. but it actually was.
You met not long before your dad's death, maybe 18 months, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the truth is, that's actually why the book came into being. So what happened in the course of that conversation is my partner happened to use this like completely everyday phrase, lost and found, that became the title of the book. And in that very strange way, it's hard to know how the mind will work, especially at 2 a.m. in Nowheresville, Alabama. I really I landed on the and. And it's exactly because of that, because I found my partner and lost my father in relatively quick succession, quick enough that I was still falling in love when he began truly dying. And so I've been thinking a lot about this kind of emotional conjunction, the way that love and grief actually are really inseparable, as are so many experiences of adult life. And that was immediately interesting to me. I was interested in the category of loss and exploring it. And I was interested in the category of discovery and exploring that. But I got very interested when I thought, oh, but these are not like separate little silverware drawers with all the forks and spoons nicely sorted. These are things we experience at once. And that's a whole third category of emotional experience that's worth investigating. And that was kind of the moment that I decided to write the book.
Right. And for people who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet, it's structured around those three concepts, right? It starts with, the first third of the book, roughly, you're focusing on loss. And then the second section, you're focusing on discovery. And the third section, you're focusing on the conjunction of the two, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that an accurate way of characterizing?
Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh.
And so did you always know you were going to tell it that way, or was your first impulse to tell it chronologically?
No, I always knew I was going to tell it that way. That was, to be honest, kind of, it came into being as a book the minute that this kind of lost and found, almost the minute Casey said the phrase. I knew right away, oh, okay, it's not a 2-part book, with just the loss and finding mirroring each other. It's a 3-part book, and this is the structure, and that's the organizing principle. So it was a great gift to me, because as I'm sure everyone listening knows, structure, at least for me, structure is always the hardest part of writing. So walking into a book knowing at least the macro structure was an incredible relief.
Right. And I also want to point out, for those who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book, that not only do you share your own insights from your own personal experience and your own observations, but you turn to a rich array of thinkers for their insights, including, but not limited to, scientists, poets, novelists, and philosophers. And what I was wondering as I read it is, were you synthesizing reading you'd already done, because I know you're such a big reader, or did you actively seek out literature in different disciplines about loss and discovery?
It's a great question. Some of each, some of what's in the book is kind of my own inner anthology, the stuff I turn to again and again. That's especially true of the poetry in the book. Mm-hmm. But some of it, yes, was stuff I went and found specifically in order to write this. And in part, that's because, some of it's arcane. There's no other reason I would be reading it. I mean, I read, for complicated reasons that we won't spoil for people who haven't read the book, I read 3 entire books about meteorites in order to read this book. And I read, an incredible book about, which actually tragically very little of this wound up showing up in the book, but I read a fascinating book about, it's literally called Lost Person Behavior. And as you might guess, it's about how people behave when they're lost. So some of it really was quite specific to the subject matter, because obviously going into this, I didn't know anything about, things like how, the Defense Department went about locating lost U-boats during World War II. But, some of that stuff turned out to be interesting and turned out to belong in the book. And some of it was kind of a combination in the sense that, here's a great example. I love William James. I've read a lot of William. There's a lot of William James to read, and I haven't read all of it, but I've read a lot of William James. And when I sat down to think about the third section of this book, the "and" section, I was immediately a little stumped, because, if you want to go read about grief, it's not hard to find, shelves upon shelves upon shelves of books about grief, and likewise love, right? There's no shortage of writing about love in Western literature or literature in general. But if what you want to write about is the idea of and, of conjunction, where do you begin, right? Like, what a weird idea, and I knew it was a weird idea, but I was very interested in it. And I thought, well, when all else fails, begin with William James. And I mean, sure, it's incredible. There's nothing you've thought that someone hasn't thought before you. And there is a gorgeous passage in William James about this word and, basically, and about the idea of conjunction and what it means to join things together. And once you find a little foothold like that, you think, oh, well, then now there are these 3 other things I should go read. And those 3 things turn into 7 things. And one of those has an incredible bibliography at the end, and it unfurls. That's how these things go. But yeah, so it was a combination of the 2.
Right. So I'm curious, in what ways is the finished book that we have access to and that I enjoyed different from the draft you first turned into your editor?
Not many. So, and that is not because there weren't many drafts that were different along the way. I am one of these writers who tends to keep my cards a little bit close to my chest when I'm working on something. Not unto everyone. My partner reads everything in draft form multiple times, and a handful of other people sometimes read early drafts. But with this book, the truth is I did not write it in order. And the found and the and sections actually came relatively easily. And I don't say that lightly because I'm not someone who usually finds writing to come easily. But the last section was incredibly difficult, and it was not difficult for the reason you're thinking. It was not because it was the one about grief. It was not because it was the one about the death of my father. Not that that isn't incredibly sad, but by the time I sat down to write it, I had worked through the emotional problems and was kind of confronted with the intellectual ones. And the hardest of those in some ways was that I had already written this essay about it. And I hadn't really experienced that before, where you've crafted this thing that's about the thing you're writing about, but it was bespoke, of course. It's 6,000 words, and it has to have a beginning and a middle and an ending and be completely freestanding and function like a New Yorker essay would function. And then you're trying to start a book with the same idea and the same sets of kind of sources and subjects, and yet you can't do it the same way, even if you desperately want to. So I had to kind of smash that original piece to figure out how to get into this, all of which is just a very long-winded way of saying that had you been privy to a bunch of early drafts of the book that not even my editor saw for the most part, mainly what you would have seen was me flailing around trying a bunch of different ways into the book.
So it's 8:05. I thought we might take some questions from students and other audience members. Sure. And then if there's time, I'll ask you a couple more questions at the end. We'll see.
Sounds great.
Okay, so my assistant, Sam Apple, is going to send me some questions, right? Oh, Sam has sent me some questions from the audience. Okay, what is one piece of writing advice that you have received in your life as a writer that is particularly valuable to you and that you hold on to?
Well, at the risk of sounding like some kind of strange ancient guru who speaks in, bizarre, indirect ways, I'm going to give you one piece of advice I've held on to. It's a piece of running advice, not a piece of writing advice, but I will explain why it's what immediately comes to mind. I love to run. And when I was younger and actually invested in being a better runner, I once asked a running coach how I could speed up my pace. And he looked at me and he said, "The way to run faster is to run faster." And I've never forgotten it, because it's absolutely true, right? There is actually no way to run faster except to run faster, even though it feels horrible and awful. And, but the point is, it's hard and difficult. And then you keep doing it and it gets a little bit easier. And then faster is something else. It's a farther goal, further down the line.
Right.
And that's how it always works. And to me, that's actually a perfect piece of writing advice
Uh-huh.
because the only way to write is to write. And it doesn't matter if it's hard, and it doesn't matter if it feels miserable, and it doesn't matter if you feel like you're barely getting better. It matters that you're doing it. And this is, I realize, kind of the most hackneyed piece of writing advice of all time, but the way to write is to write. You just have to sit down in a chair and turn off all your distractions and, focus on the issue at hand. Notice yourself when you're getting distracted, because what you're doing is avoiding thinking, and there is no, we talk all the time about writing. Writing is beautiful. Much of writing is craft, but the bulk of the really important part of writing is thinking, and thinking is difficult and painful, and you just have to sit down and do it.
Right. Are you good at blocking out online distractions when you're at your computer?
Only when absolutely necessary. No, am I good at it? I used to be horrible at it, and therefore literally would rely on these kind of artificial interventions like Freedom, these programs that would like lock you off the internet for a long time. And then I got better at it when I fell in love, because the internet was less interesting to me. And then I would distract myself by, pestering my partner instead of doing my work. But she would often, unlike the internet, she would say, go do your work. So that was helpful. And now we have a baby, and the baby has taught me that there is no time in life to procrastinate. So that's, I guess, helped.
Right. Okay, another question from a student. What creative and practical advice would you have for someone writing their first book?
Well, I'm going to give two opposite sounding pieces of advice. One is basically a variation on what I just said, which is you have got to write, and you have to do it every day. It's easier, strange as that sounds, it's easier if you do it every day. The farther you get away from it, the more difficult it is. But that's by and large a solitary experience. And I guess because of that, the second piece of advice is do cultivate a community, even if it's one person, even if it's a friend or someone in your writing program with you, or, a sibling, whoever it may be. Find someone who you can talk to, who makes you excited about your idea all over again, and helps you think through it, and can just be the sounding board, both for the idea stuff and for the process stuff, because both are important. And actually, I'm going to give one last really practical piece of advice, because I was given this piece of advice very young, and it's one of the few that I've held on to all these years because it's actually really useful. The advice was park on a downhill, meaning don't stop for the day at a difficult place. You're being very unfriendly to the you of tomorrow. Be nice to the you of tomorrow, and stop somewhere easier than that. Stop somewhere where you have some momentum, and you'll be able to get into your work for the next day.
So another question is, do you have any idea what your next book will be?
Boy, do I not have any idea what my next book will be. I have waited historically more than a decade between books. This is only my second one. So I would be surprised if it were anytime soon. I certainly don't know what it will be about. I can tell you what I wish it would be, which is, I have always wanted to just write a yarn. I'm forever drawn to these kind of big abstract ideas. I give you like error, or loss, or discovery, or conjunction, and right. I'm drawn to these very kind of philosophical or abstract categories of human experience, and that's interesting and great, and it's how my mind works, and whatever, it's the mind I have. But boy, it's fun to tell the story, and I would dearly love to find a story that deserves to be told at book length.
That would be wonderful. So we have now two questions about the really big one, which I will ask together. So the really big one is what is Kathryn's New Yorker piece from 2015 about how basically eventually, maybe in 25 years, maybe in 75 years, but definitely sometime pretty soon, there's going to be a major tsunami in the Pacific Northwest that we are utterly unprepared for. Is that a good summary?
I'll take it.
Okay. So first question, how long did it take you to finish the really big one? I assume that means from the inception of the idea until publication. And next question about the really big one is, when I read the really big one, I was struck by how you used oral histories to learn about a previous tsunami. The intersection with geological evidence was fascinating. What gave you the idea to incorporate oral histories in the story?
Well, I'll take those in order. So the timeline of that piece got a little bit strange for reasons that you've actually already heard. I brought that idea to the New Yorker as a freelancer in 2014. And then they hired me as a book critic in 2015. And as a result, I kind of immediately was on the hook for a bunch of book reviews, as you might imagine. So that piece wound up taking me probably, actually, now that I think about it, I started thinking about that piece in 2013. So that piece wound up taking me, basically a year and a half, 2 years to write. But that is a very strange way to say it, because it's not remotely as if I was spending a year and a half or 2 years writing it. It was just kind of chronically on the back burner, and I would go do a little bit more reporting for it. And then finally we sort of got it on the books, and I actually buckled down and started trying to write it. And that was, a more normal length process. I want to say probably 5 or 6 months, something like that, which would be very long for me for a piece of book criticism or an essay, but is not wildly crazy for a reported piece. As to the oral, I just
froze me a sec.
Oh, sorry, am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Oh, sorry about that. As to the oral histories, it's just one of those things that was, as soon as I read about it, there's no way I was going to leave it out. For those of you who haven't read the piece, so there is this fault line in the Pacific Northwest that, yes, someday is going to produce a massive earthquake, and in response, a massive, kind of Indonesia scale tsunami for which we're woefully unprepared. And those earthquakes happen on a periodicity of, in the kind of, don't quote me, I haven't looked at that piece in forever, but 340 years, say, something along that scale. So the last time one happened in the Northwest, there was no European presence there at all. But there were many indigenous communities living there, and there were these wonderful tribal accounts. I shouldn't say wonderful, they're obviously tragic and terrible, but wonderful in the sense of rich and detailed history, if you're interested in history. There were, tribal accounts of, this tremendous earthquake and water just flooding the land to these unbelievable depths and wiping out entire communities. And it was fascinating to me how those stories were regarded by Westerners who encountered them as folklore, which from a Western mindset makes a certain amount of sense, because we have a lot of folklore about floods, right? This is kind of core to our own cultural identity. But then, of course, as soon as there was scientific evidence to back this up, it became apparent that this alleged folklore was in fact just oral history, and actually shockingly accurate oral history. It's incredible the extent to which you can kind of trace, you can sort of look for timing clues in those stories, and they do all converge around what is now known to be the last year that an earthquake struck in that region, which was sometime around 1700 or 1701, something like that. And it felt important to me to include because, science writing and science are wonderful and delightful for me as a reader and thinker, and crucial for all of us as a society, but they don't exist separate from the biases of a culture. They don't exist separately from the stories a culture tells itself. They don't exist separately from the very different kind of values we place on different kinds of communities and inputs and ideas. So to me, that was just it had to be in there. It partly because, to some extent, the piece is about our history, and it's about what we can see and what we fail to see, and what we can believe and what we fail to believe.
Okay, we have a question about your book, Lost and Found. As you're speaking about The Ideas of Lost and Found, I want to ask about your essay, How I Proposed to My Girlfriend. Firstly, I'm an LGBTQ plus science writer, and it was so beautiful to read such a raw and lovely personal essay that doesn't center around the experience of coming out, just simply being in love. So I appreciated that immensely and want to thank you for that. Can you speak to the relationship between that essay and the book?
I can. It's a very straightforward relationship. That essay is simply an excerpt from the book.
Okay.
I think that we maybe added like a sentence or two at the beginning to set it up so there was kind of context for readers coming to it as you did as a freestanding piece. But that was, we just placed that in the New Yorker as an excerpt from the book. The book, of course, has much more to say about falling in love and getting to know my partner and proposing to her and marrying her.
And one thing I want to say about the book that hasn't come up yet in any of my questions or the students' questions is there is a lot of science in the book. It's a memoir, and we've talked about how there's a lot of poetry also and philosophy, but you find ways. I don't know if you were looking to do it or if it just came naturally, but every few pages there's an extended discussion of some natural or physical phenomenon. Is that something that you talk about a hike you took with Casey or an experience that your father-in-law had in nature? So was that something you consciously set out to do, or is that just because nature and science are such big parts of your life?
I think the latter. To me, the world it's good I didn't go into academia, because what you need to be able to do in academia is focus narrowly and deeply in one area. And it turns out I'm hopelessly bad at that. Actually, I kind of tromp all over and across disciplinary boundaries. And I think that's partly because to me, they all feel kind of inseparable. I mean, this must be why I was drawn to the idea of conjunction too, right? Like to me, my love of my partner and my love of the natural world and my love of science and my interest in all these things, they don't really, I don't know, they seem to kind of, you pull on the thread and they all just kind of come towards you as right. One big bundle. So it was not a conscious decision. Some of it was, to some extent you work with the material you have, right? And for various reasons, that it probably doesn't make sense to get into, but will be obvious once you read the book. There were anchors in the natural world. I mean, there was a reason I was reading about meteorites. Arguably there was not necessarily a reason for a medium length excursus on geology that opens the last section of the book, but it's how my mind works, and I'm interested. Right. Some of it too, I think.
I want to just tell people, because that was one of my favorite passages. Kathryn doesn't just tell us that she settled in a part of the country called the Eastern Shore of Maryland, but she gives us the entire geological history of the Eastern Shore of Maryland, right?
Yes, which a reader might reasonably object to, and I'm mindful of that. But for me, I think part of what's going on when something like that happens in my book or in something I'm writing is that I'm very interested in scale. I think I'm always mindful on some level. There's the immediacy of our own lives, right? And we're like falling in love, or we've just like cracked our head on the shelf because we stood up too quickly, or we're irritated with our mother, or we're like on the deadline for peace. There's always this immediate thing happening, right? And sometimes that's glorious, right? You're in love and it's amazing. You're just like lying there having a wonderful evening with your partner. But there is always the backdrop, right? And the backdrop is the cosmos. I mean, the backdrop is insane. It's the whole planet, and beyond that, it's the whole galaxy and it's the whole universe. And for whatever reason, like those things never recede that far for me. Like I always know there's this kind of like very strange juxtaposing of scale, of the scale of our own lives and the scale of existence. And that's fascinating to me. And so it's always just asserting itself in my work.
And what's wonderful is you, and this is true of a lot of your essays about books and ideas in the New Yorker, you do the research so we don't have to. You clearly read many books about geology and deep history. And that were probably, I mean, let's be honest, not so well written, or written in a very academic way. And then you managed to distill it into a couple of pages of stunningly clear prose.
So thank you. That's nice of you to say. I think that's the job description.
And now another student has a question. Could you please speak more about book reviewing? What's good preparation for that? How does one get started? And what do you look for or think about when reading to review? How is reading to review different from other reading?
That's a great question. So how do you prepare? Well, I remember when I got hired by New York Magazine, I was so excited. And then like one day later, I was like, like I have to go read all the like great critics, like a lot of people, Eliot, McCarthy, like a lot, there's a lot of people who really, not only great critics, but have staked out like actual theories of literature and they sort of write about books in the context of these like belief systems about how books should work. And I had a little crisis about how I hadn't read any of that. I will remind you, I studied English, history, not English. And so then I like built up this stack of books by the side of my bed to read. And then I never read basically almost any of them, which is to say that's a great way to do it if you happen to be pre-existingly really knowledgeable about kind of theories of literature and theories of how books work. And I am not trying to diminish those at all. I'm envious of people with that knowledge. And I think it can be really illuminating and really helpful when you're thinking about a book in front of you and why it's great or why it's not great. But if you aren't armed with those tools, don't panic like I did. It's a waste of time. I think, what do you need? You need to love books. You really need to love books so that you can be dismayed when you don't love them and thrilled and want to shout about them from the rooftops when you do love them. And you need to be able to understand, at least within yourself, why you love something, right? Why unto you is this book great, or why unto you is this book terrible? And that's frankly kind of the name of the game. And it's helpful if you can put that in various contexts, including the context of the author's other work or the context of other books on that subject, but it's not necessary. The small bore look at a single book is a beautiful thing and probably the easiest place to start. And as a practical matter, in terms of getting started, if what you want to do is pitch book reviews, it's hard. I'm mindful that book review space has shrunk drastically, over the last handful of decades, which is a real shame. But your best bet is you got to find something that you have a legitimate purchase on. If you can say, this is a book about, suburban life in, Boise, Idaho, where I happen to grow up, you're a little bit more of a compelling candidate to an editor who might not otherwise know anything about you. So that's always helpful. I feel like there were two other parts of this question that I've now left behind me so far that I can't even recall what they were.
Well, no, I think you answered it quite well, actually. How is reading to review different from other reading? I want to say more about that.
Mostly, in my case, at least, it just involves always having a pen in my hand. I don't experience them as that differently, I think, because I tend to be, I guess that's not quite true. I tend to be fairly analytical, so it's hard for me to disconnect the critical part of my brain. But there's no question that, if I'm lying around reading the Hilary Mantel books for the sheer pleasure of, thinking about Henry VIII, that's a very different experience than if I'm, holding my copy of Walden and deciding after many years of disliking it to finally try to figure out why. And it really does, I think, largely, initially it comes down to, like, as I said, reading it with a pen in your hand. You're trying to isolate passages and think about how they work and think about why you're reacting to them the way they are. And then in my case, there's often kind of a broadening out move that happens after that. Maybe I go and I read the other transcendentalists, or I read other criticism, or whatever the book under review is, I start to, there's kind of concentric circles around it that to various degrees I start to engage with. So it's certainly it's just a much more deliberative practice.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question from students, and I might be able to fit in one last point I'd like to make. So this is the last question from students. What has been your relationship with self-doubt or lack thereof?
Well, definitely not lack thereof. I wish that sounds peaceful. I think it's very hard to not have self-doubt. I'll stick to the realm of writing, although I suspect this to be true more broadly. I think it's very hard to not have self-doubt as a writer, especially when you're newish at it and starting out. I think that for me, the saving grace was that the self-doubt was, well, I mean, at a very basic level, if you read this book, the thing you'll learn is I'm very lucky. I come from a very happy and loving family. And I think that was probably the greatest insulation against the self-doubt. There was just this sense of, there are people who will love me no matter how badly I feel at this. And that's always a relief. And indeed, my self-doubt also, it's not that it lessened exactly, it just became less noisy, and I didn't have to pay as much attention to it after I fell in love, because I had better things in my life to think about than whether I was horrible and this piece was going to be awful and I was going to be fired. I think that the thing for me about the self-doubt was, I don't want to understate how bad it could be. I was one of these writers. I'm mercifully not this kind of writer anymore, but for many, many years, until horrifyingly recently, I was one of these writers who would stay up 4 nights in a row, getting steadily further behind a deadline, and inevitably would wind up in tears, and not inevitably, but 3 out of 5 pieces would wind up in tears, and not understand what I was doing and sort of hate it. And then, it would seem impossible, and ultimately it would be fine. And, at that time, and as I said, I'm not that kind of writer anymore. And I do want to emphasize, you don't have to be that kind of writer. Really, you don't have to. If you think you have to suffer like that to write, you are actually wrong. It is not the secret sauce of writing well. It's not good for you. It's not good for your writing. It's not good for your sleep. It's not good for the other people in your life. Don't do it. It took me 20 years to learn that, but don't do it. But even when I was miserable like that, I guess the thing for me was that my actual conviction that this was the thing I wanted to do and that I loved doing was always stronger even than the misery.
Mm-hmm. I would just like to close with an idea that you leave readers with at the end of your book. I don't want to tell people too much about the end of your book, but at the end of the book, you make the point that we all are mortal and we all therefore are going to lose everything eventually. But you say, may I read? No, you know what? You should probably read it if anyone's going to read. But basically,
I like to hear other people read it. It's fine.
Okay. So basically, you have a way of you offer some subtly, you offer some advice for contending with our mortality. Loss is a kind of external conscience urging us to make better use of our finite days. Our crossing is a brief one, best spent, bearing witness to all that we see, honoring what we find noble, tending what we know needs our care, recognizing that we are inseparably connected to all of it, including what is not yet upon us, including what is already gone. We are here to keep watch, not to keep. And I just wanted to end with that because it's a beautiful way of being both realistic about the fact that life is full of loss and ultimately ends with loss, but also being mindful and being grateful for the time that we do have. Did you come to that ending easily?
Well, yes and no. Originally, I came to it with great difficulty, but it is the ending of the essay that I wrote. It is, in fact, one of the only pieces of that essay that emerged from my shattering of it in order to write the book intact. And I always knew that it would. I remember very distinctly the moment that I landed on that ending. The whole piece was done. And to the point of, do I share things early with my editors? I really adore my editor at the New Yorker, and I had sent him the piece because I needed to. The time had come deadline wise, and I said, the ending's not right. I'm still working on it. Just ignore that part. I'll get there. And he's a very patient man, so he said no problem. And it's maybe 36 hours later. It was evening, and I was sitting in a chair in my living room in the dark, just like holding a printout of the piece and trying to understand what it was I was trying to say and what I felt about loss. And, language is really sometimes your friend. I was thinking about loss and how painful it is and the desire to hold on to things. And I had just been stuck on this language of loss. And I suddenly kind of shifted just ever so slightly to the side to the language of keeping, like this desire to keep everything that we have. And the minute I got to keeping, I got to keep watch. And I knew I knew it was the right ending because it's the deep point, right? It's intellectually and emotionally, right? Not just kind of wordplay. I do believe that we cannot, it's not a matter of belief. We can't actually hold on to the things that we love, but we certainly can treat our lives and our experience here as caretakers and as tenders of everything around us for those who need our help and those who come after us. And so it just felt immediately right. And I knew when I sat down to write the book that whatever else happened, I knew there was no way I was going to improve upon that as an ending. It's a rare thing as a writer to just know, that it's right. And that was a great gift, actually, because it's wonderful. In addition to knowing the structure of a book, what a gift to know where you're going to land.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for your time with us. Kathryn's book is called Lost and Found, a memoir. And I would also like to thank, in addition to Kathryn, I'd like to thank Sam Apple and Peter Huggins and Melissa Hendricks-Joyce behind the scenes at Johns Hopkins. And that's a wrap.
And I just want to thank everyone for spending their Wednesday evening this way. It's a pleasure. And for those of you who are headed into a writing career, very good luck to all of you.
Thank you so much. Good night.